My cousin smiled at me from across the ballroom, pointed toward the entrance, and said, "Reagan, be a sweetheart, and greet the guests at the door." I nodded, pinned on the name tag his wife had printed for me, and walked away. He had no idea that the guests he was waiting for were the same men who were about to discover that the woman standing at his front door was the only reason he had a company left to celebrate. The tag was smaller than I expected. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the gold lettering on the ballroom doors, not the string quartet playing something classical and expensive from somewhere inside, not the scent of fresh roses and money that hit me the moment I stepped off the elevator. Just the tag. White cardstock, black print, 2 words centered in the middle, like a verdict someone had already decided before I walked through the door. Hostess. I stood in front of the floor-length mirror at the end of the corridor and looked at it sitting in my palm. The St. Regis. Atlanta knew how to make a person feel small without trying. The ceilings were too high, the marble floors too polished, the lighting too golden and deliberate. Everything in this building was designed to remind you of your place. And tonight, apparently, my place had been printed on a little white card and handed to me with a smile. The smile had belonged to Diana. Marcus's wife had been standing just inside the entrance of the ballroom when I arrived, wearing a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my first car. She was the kind of woman who had learned early that beauty was a weapon, and she carried herself accordingly. Chin lifted, shoulders back, eyes, doing a slow, surgical sweep of everything and everyone around her. When she saw me walk in, she did not say hello. She did not ask how my drive was. She reached to the table beside her, picked up the name tag, and held it out between 2 perfectly manicured fingers, like she was offering me something generous. "Reagan," she said in that smooth, practiced tone of hers, "so glad you could make it. We need someone warm and welcoming at the entrance. You'd be perfect." I looked at the tag. I looked at her. And then I took it, because sometimes the smartest thing a person can do is exactly what nobody expects. Marcus was standing 15 feet away when it happened. My cousin, the man whose name was printed in gold script on every surface. In this ballroom, the man this entire evening had been constructed to celebrate, was deep in conversation with one of his colleagues, gesturing broadly, already performing for an audience. He glanced over once when I walked in, just once, and then he turned back to his conversation like I was part of the furniture. No, hello, no happy you're here, not even a nod. We had grown up in the same family, spent holidays around the same table, and tonight, on the evening his family had spent $22,000 to celebrate his rise, I had been handed a name tag and pointed toward the door. I clipped it onto my blazer. The small click of the metal fastener felt louder than it should have. I was making my way toward the entrance when Uncle Harold stepped into my path. Marcus's father was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s who had spent most of his life believing that volume was the same thing as authority. He barely looked at me before he spoke. "Good," he said, glancing down at the tag on my lapel and then back up toward the ballroom. "At least she's useful for something tonight." He said it to Aunt Beverly, who was standing just behind him. He said it like I wasn't there, like I was an arrangement that had been placed correctly and could now be ignored. I did not respond. I had learned a long time ago that silence in the right hands is not weakness. It is precision. The entrance of the St. Regis Ballroom opened onto a wide, carpeted corridor lined with tall floral arrangements, white orchids and eucalyptus, elegant and deliberate. From where I stood, just outside the doors, I had a clean sightline into the room itself. The tables were draped in ivory linen. The centerpieces caught the candlelight. A towering arrangement of gold balloons spelled out his initials near the stage. And somewhere beneath all of it, a catering team moved in careful choreography, adjusting and perfecting everything in preparation for the guests who would arrive within the hour. It was beautiful. I will give them that. It was the kind of beautiful that takes money and certainty. The certainty that you belong in a room, that the room was made for you, that the flowers in the lighting, in the music, all exist to confirm something you already believe about yourself. I stood at the edge of it and felt none of those things. What I felt instead was a stillness that had taken me years to build, a kind of quiet that does not come from peace, but from knowing. Knowing what was in my bag. Knowing what I had spent the last week preparing. Knowing that the evening stretched out ahead of us, like a road that looked one way from where Marcus was standing and looked entirely different from where I was. I reached into my bag, without thinking, my fingers brushing against something flat and solid near the bottom. I left it there. There would be time for that later. Right now, there were guests to greet. I straightened my blazer, adjusted the tag on my lapel, and turned to face the elevator bank at the end of the corridor. Hostess, it read. I almost smiled. To understand why I was standing at that door, you need to know who built the man celebrating inside. And to understand that you need to go back further than most people would expect. My parents passed when I was 11. A car accident on a Tuesday morning in November. The kind of ordinary, senseless thing that rewrites everything without warning. I do not talk about them often, not because the memory hurts, but because I have spent a long time learning the difference between grief and baggage. What I will say is this. When they were gone, the only family I had left was Uncle Harold's household. And Uncle Harold made it clear, in ways that were never spoken out loud, but always understood, that I was a guest in his home. Tolerated, managed, never quite belonging. Marcus was their son, their only child. The center of every room he walked into. Not because he demanded it, but because his parents arranged the furniture of their lives around him so consistently that it simply became the natural order of things. He got the bigger bedroom, the better school, the louder applause at every graduation, every promotion, every milestone that the family decided was worth celebrating. I got a roof over my head and the quiet understanding that gratitude was the only currency I was permitted to spend. What I also got, though, nobody planned this part, was time. Time to watch. Time to learn. Time to understand how power actually moves through a room. Not through the people who talk the loudest, but through the ones who decide who gets to talk at all. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had built something. Quietly, deliberately, the way you build things when nobody is watching, because nobody expects you to build anything at all. A seat at a table that most people do not even know exists. A board position at a mid-sized firm called Callaway Group, one of 3 Fortune-adjacent companies that operated below the radar of public attention, but above the threshold of real consequence. The kind of company that does not make headlines, but makes decisions that eventually become headlines for someone else. I had earned my place on that board through 7 years of work that I will not detail here, because the details are not the point. The point is that I was there, and nobody in Uncle Harold's house knew. Marcus found out about the board position the same way he found out about most things. Indirectly, through a conversation he was not supposed to overhear at a family dinner 3 years ago. He pulled me aside afterward in the kitchen, and for the first time in the 30 years we had spent orbiting the same family, he looked at me like I was someone worth speaking to carefully. He asked if I could help him. He had been at Callaway Group for 4 years by then, a mid-level manager with decent numbers and a gift for presenting other people's ideas as his own. The board had been discussing restructuring his division. There were names on a list. His was one of them. He knew it, and he was scared in the way that men who have always been told they are exceptional tend to get scared when reality introduces itself without an appointment. I listened to him talk for 20 minutes in that kitchen. I watched him choose his words carefully, watched him try to calibrate exactly how much to ask for without revealing how desperate he actually was. And when he was done, I asked him one question. If I help you, Marcus, what changes? He said everything. He said he would be different. He said family was everything to him. And he had not been showing that, and he knew it. And this was his chance to prove it. He looked me in the eye when he said it. I believed him the way you believe someone when you want the thing they are promising to be true more than you want to examine whether it actually is. 3 weeks later, I sat in a boardroom on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta. 12 people around a table. Victor Shaw at the head, the chairman of the board. A man in his late 60s who had the kind of stillness that comes from never needing to prove anything to anyone. Patricia Cole to his left, a senior board member with 30 years of corporate experience and a talent for reading people that made most lawyers nervous. James Whitfield across from her, the firm's largest outside investor, a man who communicated primarily through silence and the occasional raised eyebrow. The agenda item was Marcus's division. The word restructuring sat in the middle of the room like something nobody wanted to be the first to touch. I waited until the conversation had run its course. And then I spoke. I made the case for Marcus, the way I make every case, without sentiment, without performance, with nothing but the data and the logic, and the one argument that mattered most, that the cost of losing him was higher than the cost of investing in him, and that with the right structure and the right title, he could deliver what the division needed. It took 40 minutes. At the end of it, Victor Shaw looked at me across the table with an expression I had seen on his face only a handful of times. It was not agreement exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the look of a man who has just recalibrated. The vote was 4-3. Marcus kept his position. More than that, a new title was created, Chief Executive Officer, the first in the company's restructured hierarchy. Afterward, the room cleared. I stayed behind to sign the formal documentation. The pen was heavy, the kind that costs more than it should, the kind that sits on boardroom tables, specifically to make you feel the weight of what you are doing. I signed my name. I stared at it for a moment, the letters neat and deliberate, on the line, marked board authorization. I thought I was giving him a future. I had no idea he was already planning mine. The clock above the ballroom entrance read 7:14. I had been standing at that door for just over an hour, and in that time, 43 people had walked past me without making eye contact. I had counted. It was the kind of thing you do when you need your mind to stay somewhere useful instead of somewhere dangerous. 7:14. 1 week ago, I had been sitting at my desk at 6 in the evening, finishing the last of a briefing document, when my phone lit up with Marcus's name. I almost did not answer. Not because I did not want to talk to him. I had simply learned over the years that calls from Marcus at unusual hours rarely had anything to do with me, and everything to do with something he needed. I answered anyway. Reagan. His voice had that particular warmth he deployed selectively, the kind that felt genuine, until you recognized the architecture of it. I've been meaning to call. We're doing something for my birthday. A proper celebration, the kind Diana's been talking about for months. I want family there. Real family. I waited. I need someone to help manage the evening, he continued. Greet the guests. Make sure everything runs smoothly at the entrance. You're so good with people, Reagan. You always have been. It would mean a lot to me if you were there. I noticed what he did not say. He did not say, come as my guest. He did not say, sit at my table. He said, manage the evening. He said, greet the guests. He dressed it up in warmth and family. And it would mean a lot. But underneath the phrasing, the ask was precise. He wanted me at the door. I told him I would be there. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my office. The city was doing what Atlanta does at early evening, settling into itself, the light going amber and long through the windows. I was still looking at my phone when the notification appeared. A new message in my inbox from an address I did not recognize. No name, no signature, just a subject line that read, you should know what's happening at Callaway Group. I opened it. The email contained three attachments and no body text. Just the file sitting there like something left on a doorstep in the middle of the night. I opened the first one. It was a term sheet, a preliminary agreement between Callaway Group and a holding company registered in a jurisdiction I recognized immediately as a common vehicle for offshore financial structuring. The numbers were substantial. The terms were specific. And buried in the language of the third clause, written in the careful, neutral phrasing that lawyers use when they want something consequential to sound administrative, was a transfer of controlling interest. 51%. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, more slowly. The way you read something when your mind is resisting what your eyes are already understanding. If the agreement in that document was executed, the board's authority over Callaway Group would be effectively dissolved. The firm's current leadership, every position ratified by the board, including the one I had cast a deciding vote to create, would be subject to review and replacement by the new controlling party. And the individual identified as the facilitating executive on the seller's side, the person whose signature would authorize the transfer, was listed by title only. Chief Executive Officer. I closed my laptop, picked up my phone, and called Claire Nash. Claire had been my attorney for 6 years, a sharp, careful woman who had spent 2 decades in corporate law before deciding she preferred working with a smaller number of clients she actually trusted. She did not rattle easily. She did not speculate. She dealt in what could be proven and what could not. And she had a gift for telling you difficult things in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. She called me back within the hour, and we met the following morning in her office on the 22nd floor of a building in Buckhead, the kind of office that is deliberately understated, because the people who use it do not need to impress anyone with the furniture. I laid the documents on her desk without preamble. She read them in silence, which with Claire meant she was taking them seriously. When she finished, she set them down and looked at me with the expression she reserved for situations that required precision. "These are real," she said. It was not a question. That's what I needed to know. She tapped the 3rd page. "The offshore structure is deliberate. Whoever put this together wanted the originating party to be difficult to trace quickly. But the term sheet is binding in its current form if both parties execute. The timeline." She paused, checking the date printed in the header. "Gives you about 8 days before the window closes." 8 days. The birthday party was in 7. "There's something else," Claire said. She pulled up something on her screen and turned the monitor toward me. "The attorney of record on the counterparty's side. Do you recognize that name?" I looked at the screen. I did. Raymond Cole had worked in corporate law in Atlanta for 15 years before a document falsification matter ended his career at his previous firm 2 years ago. He had not been disbarred. Technically, the matter had been handled quietly, the way uncomfortable things tend to be handled when the people involved have enough resources to prefer discretion over accountability. But he had not worked at a reputable firm since. The fact that he was the attorney facilitating this particular agreement said something specific about the nature of the agreement itself. Claire folded her hands on the desk and looked at me steadily. "Reagan, what are you going to do?" The answer had been sitting in my chest since the moment I opened that email. I had not known it consciously then, but I knew it now, in the way you know something that has been true for longer than you realized. "I'm going to show up," I said, just like he asked. The next guest through the door was a woman in her 50s, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She walked past me without slowing down, without glancing at the tag on my lapel, without any acknowledgement that I existed in the same physical space as her. I held the door. She let it close behind her. And somewhere in the middle of that small, unremarkable exchange, my mind slipped the way it had been doing all evening, pulling me backward through the hours, like a current moving beneath still water. Last night, my apartment is on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that I chose specifically because it does not look like what it is. The lobby is understated. The elevator is quiet. There is nothing about the exterior that would cause anyone to stop and wonder. I have always preferred it that way. The distance between what something appears to be and what it actually is has served me well for most of my adult life. I was at my dining table by 9 in the evening, which I had cleared entirely and covered with documents. Not the originals, those were secured, but printed copies organized into 4 separate folders that I had color-coded with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes when you have already moved past the emotional part of a decision and arrived at the operational part. The first folder held the term sheet in its supporting attachments. The second held the background information on Raymond Cole, his professional history, the document falsification matter, the timeline of his association with the counterparty in the agreement. The third held a set of board governance documents that Claire had pulled for me, specifically the sections pertaining to executive misconduct and the conditions under which a board member could initiate a formal review outside of a scheduled meeting. The fourth folder was empty. It was waiting. I sat with all of it for a long time. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens late at night, with documents spread out in front of you, not the sharp, linear kind that happens in meetings and on phone calls, but something slower and more three-dimensional. You stop reading the words and start reading the spaces between them. You stop asking what and start asking why, and then you start asking what comes next. And by the time you have worked through all of that, you either have a plan or you have a clearer understanding of why you do not have one yet. By 11, I had a plan. I picked up my phone and called Jordan. Jordan Reeves had been my executive assistant for 4 years. A meticulous, quietly sharp young man who had the rare gift of understanding the difference between what I said and what I meant, and the even rarer gift of never confusing the two. He answered on the second ring, which was typical. Jordan did not miss calls. "I need you to prepare something," I told him. "Not tonight, but it needs to be ready by tomorrow evening." I told him what I needed, not everything, because Jordan did not need everything. He needed the parts that were his to execute, and he asked 3 precise, clarifying questions, and then told me it would be done. That was the entirety of our conversation. 4 years of working together had made a lot of words unnecessary. I set the phone down and looked at the folders on the table. Then I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and opened my closet. I have clothes for every version of a room I might need to walk into. Structured pieces for board meetings. Understated but unmistakable for client dinners. Things that signal, without announcing the vocabulary, of someone who learned early that what you wear is a form of communication, and that the most powerful messages are often the quietest ones. I moved past all of it. At the back of the closet, pushed to the side, in the way that useful things sometimes get pushed when they stop feeling necessary, was a simple, dark blazer. Well made, but unassuming. The kind of thing you wear when you want to be invisible. When you want people to look at you and see exactly what they expect to see and nothing more. I took it off the hanger and laid it on the bed. Next to it, I placed a pair of dark trousers. Simple shoes, no statement jewelry, nothing that would catch light or draw a second glance. Nothing that would cause someone standing in a gilded hotel ballroom to look at me and think she does not belong here as a guest. She belongs here as something else entirely. I stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the outfit for a moment. Diana had already sent a message earlier that week confirming my role for the evening. The word she had used was coordinator. The name tag she had arranged said hostess. The implication underneath both words was the same: you are here to be useful. You are here to serve a function. You are here because we need someone to stand at the door, and you were the most convenient option available. What Diana had not considered, and what Marcus had not considered, and what none of them had considered, was that I had chosen this. Not the humiliation, not the name tag, but the position. Because a person standing at the entrance of a room sees everything that enters it. They know who arrives first and who arrives last. They know who looks nervous and who looks comfortable. They know which guests glance around the moment they walk in searching for the person they actually came to see, and which guests already know exactly where they are going before the door has fully opened behind them. A person at the door holds a kind of information that the people inside the room never have. I had spent the last week making sure that information would matter tonight. I chose the plainest clothes I owned. If Marcus wanted a hostess, I would give him one. What he forgot was that even a hostess can hold the keys to the entire building. The sound of tires on wet pavement is different from tires on dry ground. It was a small thing to notice, but the rain had started sometime around 7:30. A quiet Atlanta summer rain, the kind that arrives without announcement and settles in like it has nowhere else to be. I heard the car before I saw it. A long, dark vehicle pulling smoothly to the curb, just beyond the covered entrance. The way vehicles move when the person inside has never once had to rush. The valet stepped forward. The rear door opened. Victor Shaw did not look like a man who held the kind of power he held. That was, I had always thought, precisely the point. He was in his late 60s, with the kind of face that had stopped trying to impress anyone decades ago, and had arrived somewhere quieter and more permanent on the other side of that effort. He wore a dark suit that fit the way expensive things fit, when the person wearing them has never had to think about the cost. No pocket square, no tie pin, nothing decorative. He moved through spaces like he had already decided what mattered in them, and was simply confirming what he already knew. Behind him came Patricia Cole, the board's longest-serving member, a woman in her early 60s whose professional reputation had been built on a specific and well-documented ability to read a room faster than most people could read a sentence. She was sharp in the way that does not announce itself, the way a blade does not need to be visible to be effective. She wore deep burgundy and carried herself with the particular composure of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Last through the door was James Whitfield, the firm's largest outside investor, a broad-shouldered man of 50-something who communicated primarily through the quality of his attention. When James Whitfield looked at you, you felt it. Not because he was intimidating, exactly, but because he gave the impression of someone cataloging everything in real time, filing it away in some internal system that you would never have access to. The three of them had been the deciding votes on every major decision at Callaway Group for the better part of a decade. And right now, all three of them were walking through a door that I was holding open. Victor saw me first. It was not the kind of seeing that happens when someone recognizes a face in a crowd. It was the other kind, the slower, more deliberate kind, that happens when something does not match the context around it, and your mind takes a half-second longer than usual to process why. His gaze moved from my face to the tag on my lapel. He read it. I watched him read it. And then he looked back up at me. And for a moment, that lasted considerably longer than a moment, neither of us said anything at all. There was a great deal in that silence. Victor Shaw had been in that boardroom 3 years ago. He had heard me make the case for Marcus. He had watched me cast the vote that created the position Marcus currently held. He had signed the same documentation I had signed, and he had looked at me afterward with that expression I had described to myself at the time as recalibration. He was recalibrating again now. I kept my face neutral, my posture easy. I held the door with the same unhurried steadiness I had been holding it with all evening, because the only thing more powerful than what Victor Shaw was thinking in that moment was making sure he had no way of knowing that I knew he was thinking it. Patricia reached him before he could speak. She touched his arm just briefly, just enough, and said something close to his ear that I could not hear over the ambient noise of the lobby. Whatever it was, it moved him. He adjusted his jacket, gave me one final look that I could not fully interpret, and allowed himself to be guided forward into the flow of arriving guests. He did not say my name. He did not acknowledge me in any way that someone watching would have noticed. But he had seen the tag. He had seen me. And Victor Shaw, in 30 years of corporate life, had never once looked at something without understanding exactly what he was looking at. James Whitfield was the last of the three to pass through the entrance. He had been half a step behind the other two, doing what James typically did in unfamiliar social settings, observing, before engaging, building his picture of the room, before deciding how to move through it. As he crossed the threshold, he glanced at me, the way you glance at something that registers as slightly out of place without being able to immediately identify why. Then he was inside, and the door settled closed behind him, and I was standing at the entrance of the St. Regis Ballroom at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening with a name tag on my lapel and the quiet, precise understanding that the next few hours were going to require every bit of steadiness I had spent years building. I turned back to face the corridor. The rain was still falling outside, soft, and even against the covered awning. A couple approached from the parking structure laughing about something, sharing an umbrella. I held the door. They thanked me without looking up. I nodded and let them pass. Somewhere behind me, deeper in the building, I could hear the particular rhythm of a party that had not yet decided what kind of evening it was going to be. The music, still tentative, the voices still finding their register. The whole elaborate construction of the night still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to become. And somewhere in that building, Victor Shaw was moving through a room that he did not yet fully understand. He had seen something. I just did not know yet whether that was good or bad. There are sounds that do not belong to a room, and after an hour of standing at the same door, you learn the difference. The ballroom had its own rhythm. By 8:30, the particular layered noise of a party that had settled into itself, the music finding its pace, the conversations overlapping into a steady, indistinct hum that floated out through the heavy doors every time someone passed through them. I had stopped consciously hearing it, the way you stop consciously hearing traffic when you live on a busy street. It became background. It became the baseline against which everything else registered. Which was why I heard the footsteps. They came from the east corridor, the long hallway that ran perpendicular to the main entrance, past the secondary event spaces and the service access points, ending near a set of doors that the hotel used for staff and vendor movement. It was not a route that party guests typically took. There was no reason to go that direction, unless you were looking for somewhere specific, somewhere that was not on the printed event map that Diana had distributed to the catering team earlier in the evening. The footsteps had a particular quality, deliberate, measured, the sound of someone who was moving with a destination in mind and did not want the movement itself to be noticed. I recognized them. I had grown up in the same house as Marcus Foster for 7 years. I knew the way he walked when he was performing for an audience, the broad, easy stride of a man who believed every room was watching him, and I knew the way he walked when he thought nobody was. These were the second kind. I waited until a cluster of arriving guests came through the main entrance, used the natural movement to step back from the door, and then turned and walked in the direction of the east corridor, quietly, without announcing the change in direction to anyone. There was nothing unusual about an event coordinator moving through a hotel. It was in a way exactly what the name tag said I was there to do. The east corridor was dimly lit compared to the main hall. The hotel kept the secondary passages at a lower ambient level, the kind of lighting that was functional without being welcoming. The carpet muffled sound. The walls were close enough that voices carried differently, here more contained, more private. I heard Marcus before I saw him. He was standing in an alcove near the far end of the corridor, partially obscured by the angle of a structural column. With him was a man I would have recognized anywhere in any context, under any lighting condition. Raymond Cole. The last time I had seen Raymond Cole in person was 2 years ago in a conference room where the conversation had been brief, and the outcome had been his departure from professional practice in any capacity connected to legitimate corporate work. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with the particular look of someone who had once been impressive and had spent the intervening years trying to maintain the appearance of it without the substance. He was holding a leather portfolio. On the surface of the portfolio, visible, even from where I stood, was a document of several pages. Marcus was signing it, not reading it, signing it. The pen was moving quickly, the way a pen moves when the person holding it has already read everything they needed to read somewhere else, in some other room, on some other evening when there was more time and less risk of being observed. I did not move. I was standing just at the edge of the alcove sightline, close enough to see clearly, far enough that neither of them had reason to look in my direction. The column gave me cover. The low lighting did the rest. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. My hands were steady. That surprised me a little, even though it probably should not have. I had known somewhere beneath the practical surface of the last week's preparation that this moment was likely. I had known that if Marcus was doing what the document suggested he was doing, He would not wait until after the party. He would want it done before the evening ended, while everyone who mattered was contained in one room, occupied and celebratory in looking in the wrong direction. I opened the camera. I kept the screen angled low, the phone at my side, the lens positioned to capture the alcove without requiring me to raise the device in any way that would catch peripheral attention. I pressed record. Marcus said something. I could not fully hear. The carpet and the distance absorbed the lower register of his voice, and Raymond Cole responded with a short affirmative sound and flipped to the next page of the document. Marcus signed again. The leather portfolio moved between them with the practiced ease of two people who had done this particular kind of business before, in this particular kind of way, in spaces specifically chosen for their distance from witnesses. Except that I was here, and I was watching, and the small red indicator on the screen of my phone was recording every second of it. I held the position for another 2 minutes, long enough to capture the exchange of the portfolio, long enough to capture Marcus straightening his jacket, afterward smoothing the front of it with both hands, in the gesture he had used since childhood when he wanted to reset his composure, long enough to capture Raymond Cole sliding the document into the interior of his briefcase and clicking it shut with the particular finality of a man who believed the matter was concluded. Then I pressed stop. I turned and walked back toward the main hall, at the same unhurried pace I had come, my phone already sliding back into my pocket, the corridor falling away behind me with each step. By the time I reached the main entrance and resumed my position near the door, there was nothing in my posture or my expression that would have suggested I had been anywhere other than exactly where the name tag said I should be. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the lobby. The party continued behind me, indifferent and luminous, entirely unaware that the ground beneath it had just shifted in a way that could not be undone. I pressed my hand briefly against the outside of my pocket, feeling the solid edge of the phone through the fabric. I had everything I needed. The only question now was whether I had the courage to use it. The restrooms on the second floor of the St. Regis were quieter than the ones near the main ballroom entrance. That was the reason I had come up here, not for the marble countertops or the ambient lighting, but for the distance. 30 seconds in an elevator, and you were effectively removed from the noise of the party below. Far enough to make a phone call without the music bleeding through. Close enough to get back before anyone noticed the door had been unattended. Claire answered before the second ring. 4 minutes, I told her. Then I have to go back. I gave her a brief, precise account of what I had seen in the East Corridor. The portfolio, the signatures, Raymond Cole. She already knew the name, but hearing it attached to an eyewitness account, rather than a document, produced a short silence on her end that told me she was updating her assessment. That's sufficient, she said. Combined with what we already have, that's more than sufficient. I know, I just needed you to confirm it. Consider it confirmed. A pause. Reagan, how are you holding up? It was the kind of question Claire rarely asked, which meant that when she did, it deserved an honest answer. I'll let you know when this is over, I said. She accepted that without pushing, and we ended the call. I stood at the counter for a moment. The lighting in here was softer than the lighting downstairs, less performative, less designed to make everything look like it belonged in a photograph. In this light, I looked like what I actually was. A woman in plain dark clothes, holding a phone that contained something that was going to change the course of the evening before it was finished. I turned on the faucet, cold water over my wrists, something I have done since I was a teenager, when I needed my mind to slow down to a speed I could work with. A few seconds. Then I reached for a hand towel. The door opened. I assumed it was another guest, and did not look up immediately. But the silence that followed the door closing was different from the silence of someone moving through a space with casual confidence. This was the silence of someone who had stopped on purpose. I looked up. Diana was standing just inside the door. She was still in the champagne gown from earlier, but something about the way she was wearing it had shifted. The composed architectural posture she had carried all evening, the kind that communicates a lifetime of certainty, had come undone in some way I could not precisely name, but absolutely could not miss. Her shoulders sat differently. The set of her jaw was gone. She looked at me without speaking. I looked back and waited. Diana had come up here for a reason, and the most useful thing I could do was give her room to get to it. "I know what he's doing," she said. Her voice was steady. That surprised me. Everything else about her suggested fracture, but her voice, held the way it does when the words coming out of a person are connected to a decision rather than an emotion. "I've known for 3 months," she continued. "The arrangement with Raymond, the offshore structure, the timeline." She paused. "All of it." I did not speak. I did not confirm or deny that I knew any of the things she was describing. I simply held the hand towel and let her continue. "He told me it was for us." Something moved across her face. Not grief, exactly, not anger, exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has had enough time to be finished with both. That by the time anyone understood what had happened, we'd be somewhere else, and none of it would matter a beat. He genuinely believed I would go along with it. She opened her clutch and removed a folded document. She held it out. I crossed the room and took it. A single page. Dense legal language in the upper half. In the lower half, 2 signature lines. One was already signed, Marcus's name, today's date, written beside it in his handwriting, which I would have recognized anywhere. The second line was blank. I held the page and understood what I was looking at. This was not the term sheet. This was not the preliminary agreement I had seen referenced in the original documents. This was the originating authorization, the document that, once fully executed by both parties, would make everything downstream of it legally binding and exponentially harder to reverse. Without this page completed, the entire arrangement remained contractually incomplete. A structure without a foundation. Marcus had signed his half. The second signature, the counterparty's confirmation, had never been obtained. I looked up at Diana. She was already moving toward the door. She did not look back. She offered no explanation for why she had come or what she expected me to do with what she had given me, or what any of this meant for her own life going forward. She simply opened the door with the same deliberateness with which she did everything, even now, even like this, and stepped out into the corridor without a word. The door swung shut behind her. The room went quiet, in the particular way that spaces go quiet after someone has just done something they cannot take back. I stood alone, holding the document with both hands, listening to the absence she had left behind, and then rising faintly through the floors from somewhere below, the muffled rhythm of the ballroom, the music still moving, the party still entirely unaware that anything had changed. Outside that door, my cousin was celebrating. He had no idea the woman he had assigned to greet his guests had just been handed the last piece of the puzzle. The second-floor corridor was empty by 9:15. The bulk of the arriving guests had cleared through the entrance by 8:30, and the hotel staff had shifted their attention inward toward the ballroom, toward the catering stations, toward the particular kind of invisible labor that keeps an expensive evening running without anyone noticing the effort behind it. Up here, the hallway was still and cool, the kind of quiet that a building settles into when the people inside it have all found their places and stopped moving. I found an alcove near the elevator bank, a shallow recess in the wall with a padded bench that was probably intended for guests waiting on companions, and sat down. I took out my phone. I took out the document Diana had given me and folded it carefully into the interior pocket of my blazer, close to my chest, where I could feel its edge against my ribs with every breath. Then I called Claire. She answered in 2 rings. "I'm sending you something now," I said before she could speak. 2 items, a video file and a physical document. The video is from earlier this evening, East Corridor, approximately 8:20. The document came to me about 15 minutes ago from a secondary source. I need you to look at both before we talk. Hold on. I heard the soft sound of her switching devices, the particular pause of someone who has just received something and is opening it with the focused attention of a person who understands that speed and carefulness are not mutually exclusive. I had already transferred the video from my phone to her secure receiving address while I was still in the elevator coming down from the second floor. The document I had photographed in the restroom before leaving 3 separate images to capture every line of text and sent those as well. The silence on her end lasted 4 minutes. I counted. "All right," Claire said. 2 words, but the way she said them told me everything I needed to know about what she was looking at. Claire Nash did not use tone for decoration. When her voice carried weight, it was because the weight was real. "The video is clear," she continued. "The individuals are identifiable. The exchange is unambiguous. Combined with the term sheet and the background documentation on the facilitating attorney, this constitutes a pattern of conduct that is well outside the boundaries of his fiduciary obligations as a corporate officer." A pause. "The document from your secondary source is the piece I was not expecting. Do you understand what it means that the counterparty authorization is incomplete?" "It means the arrangement can still be stopped," I said. "It means more than that. It means that if the board acts tonight, formally, on the record, the window for execution closes before it can be reopened. The counterparty cannot proceed without that authorization. And if the authorizing officer has been removed from his position before the document is completed, then it dies with the title," I said. "Precisely." I let that sit for a moment. Outside the alcove, the hallway remained empty. Somewhere at the far end of the corridor, an ice machine cycled on and off with a low mechanical hum that was the only sound in the building that had nothing to do with the party 2 floors below. "I need Jordan on the line," I said. "I'll hold." I switched to a second call. Jordan Reeves picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting to hear from me, which meant he had been ready, which was exactly what I had asked him to be when we spoke the night before. "Where are we?" I asked. "Ready," he said. 1 word. Jordan communicated in the precise minimum required, which was one of the qualities that made him genuinely invaluable. "The formal documentation is prepared. Board Governance Protocol Section 14, Subsection 3, the emergency review and removal procedure applicable outside of a scheduled meeting. I have the filing ready to transmit the moment you give me a location and a confirmation that the relevant board members are present and willing to convene." "They're present," I said. "All 3. A brief silence. "All 3, he repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation he was recording for his own reference. "Give me 20 minutes, I told him. "When I call back, be ready to transmit immediately." "Understood." I ended the call with Jordan and switched back to Claire. 20 minutes, I told her. "I'll be available," she said. And then, with the particular directness that I had come to rely on over 6 years of working together, "Reagan, once you walk into that room, there is no version of this that ends quietly. You understand that?" "I know. For any of you, including you." "I know that too," I said. She did not try to talk me out of it. That was not Claire's role, and she understood her role precisely. What she did instead was something simpler, and in that moment, considerably more useful. She said, "Then go." I ended the call. I sat in the alcove for a moment longer, my phone in my hand, the document pressed flat against my ribs inside my blazer. The hallway was still empty. The ice machine had gone quiet. From somewhere below, traveling up through the bones of the building, in the particular way that bass frequencies move through solid structures, I could feel the pulse of the music, more than hear it, a low, rhythmic presence that was easy to mistake for your own heartbeat if you were not paying attention. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I checked that the document was secure. I looked down the hallway toward the elevator bank, and then I looked in the other direction, toward the stairwell, that would take me back down to the main floor, faster and more quietly than the elevator would. The name tag was still on my lapel. I did not remove it. 3 years ago, I walked into a boardroom and gave Marcus Foster everything. Tonight, I was walking back in to take it away. The ballroom at 9:20 was a different animal than the ballroom at 7. The earlier part of the evening had that particular tentative energy of an event still finding its footing. Guests arriving in clusters, conversations starting and stopping, the music working to establish a mood that the room had not yet decided to accept. By 9:20, all of that had resolved. The party had committed to itself. The noise level had risen to the comfortable, sustained pitch of people who had stopped performing for each other and started actually talking. The catering staff moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of professionals who understood that their job was to be useful without being noticed. I came in through the side entrance near the service corridor, not the main doors I had been standing at all evening, but the secondary access point that the event staff used to move between the kitchen and the floor. It was quieter there, less trafficked, and it gave me a sightline across the room to the area near the head table where Victor Shaw had positioned himself for the better part of the last hour. He was still there, standing slightly apart from the larger clusters of conversation, as Victor tended to do at social functions, present, without being absorbed, available, without being accessible. Patricia Cole was nearby, engaged with a small group of guests I did not recognize. James Whitfield was at the bar on the far side of the room, holding a glass and listening to something a shorter man in a gray suit was telling him with considerable enthusiasm. I had a clear path to Victor. I was perhaps 15 feet away when I heard my name. Not spoken to me, spoken about me, loudly enough and in a register deliberately pitched to carry that the guests nearest to the head table, perhaps a dozen people, maybe more, turned in the direction of the voice before I did. Marcus was standing near the center of the room. He was holding a glass of champagne in one hand and a phone in the other, and he was looking directly at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, not the entitled frustration I was accustomed to reading in him. Something colder than that, something that had been prepared in advance and was now being deployed with the kind of careful, deliberate timing that told me this moment had not been improvised. "There she is," he said. The words were conversational in volume, but not in intent. They were designed to draw attention, and they succeeded. The radius of awareness around him expanded as more guests registered that something was happening, the particular social phenomenon of a room reorganizing itself around an unexpected focal point. I stopped walking. Marcus let the pause do its work, 3 seconds, 4, and then he continued, his voice modulated to the register of someone delivering unfortunate information with great reluctance. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to do this tonight," he said. "I genuinely was. But I think there are people in this room who deserve to know what's been happening at Callaway Group." He looked toward Victor Shaw, then toward James Whitfield, who had turned from the bar, then back to me. "Specifically, what's been happening with certain information that was never supposed to leave the boardroom." The room had gone considerably quieter. I stood where I was and kept my face neutral, because the worst thing I could do in this moment was react before I understood the full shape of what he was doing. Marcus had been planning this, the timing waiting until the board members were present, until the room was full, until there were enough witnesses to make any denial I offered feel defensive, was not accidental. He had constructed this moment the same way he had constructed every public performance of his life, with an audience in mind from the beginning. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He unfolded it with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes the room is already on his side, and held it up. "6 months ago," he said, "proprietary strategic information from Callaway Group's internal planning division was accessed without authorization and transmitted to a competing firm. The breach was traced to a device registered to a member of our board." He paused, letting that land. "I have the documentation here. I have the technical analysis. And I have been sitting on this for 6 months because that board member is my cousin, and I kept hoping there was an explanation I was missing." A murmur moved through the nearest cluster of guests. "There wasn't," Marcus said. He looked at me directly. "Reagan, I think you owe these people, and especially the gentleman from the board, an explanation." The document he was holding looked official. It had the visual vocabulary of legitimacy letterhead, formatting the particular density of text that reads as technical and therefore authoritative to anyone who does not have the time or the background to read it carefully. I had no way of knowing from 15 feet away how well constructed the fabrication was, but I knew it was a fabrication because the event it described had not happened. And I knew that Marcus knew it had not happened, which meant that everything about this moment, the timing, the audience, the document, the reluctant performance, had been built not to reveal a truth, but to create one in the minds of everyone watching. He was not confronting me. He was manufacturing a version of events in which I was already guilty, and doing it in a room full of people whose opinion would outlast anything I said in response. I looked at the board members in turn. James Whitfield had set his glass down on the bar. Patricia Cole had disengaged from her conversation and was watching with the focused attention of someone who files everything she observes for later use. And Victor Shaw. Victor, who had looked at my name tag 4 hours ago with that expression I had not been able to fully read, was standing very still, looking at me with something I recognized now. He was waiting, not for Marcus to finish, not for the room to settle. He was waiting for me specifically, with the particular patience of a man who has sat across enough tables from enough people to know that the most important information in any confrontation is almost never what is said first. His gaze met mine across the width of the ballroom. "Ms. Foster," Victor Shaw said. His voice was measured and even, carrying clearly, without effort, the kind of voice that does not need volume to command attention. "I need to hear your response." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to establish that what followed was not a suggestion. "And I need it now." The room waited. I did not look away from him. The door to the Magnolia Room closed with a sound, like a period at the end of a sentence. Victor had moved them here, efficiently. A word to Patricia, a gesture toward the corridor, and within 2 minutes of his question hanging in the ballroom air, the 5 of them were inside. The party on the other side of the wall ceased to exist in any practical sense. The music, the voices, the accumulated noise of a $22,000 evening, all of it reduced to nothing by 2 inches of soundproofed door. The room held a rectangular table and 8 chairs. Victor sat at the head, Patricia to his left, James to his right. Marcus took the remaining chair beside James and set his champagne glass on the table in front of him, the last sound anyone made before the silence established itself completely. Victor looked at me. "Go ahead." I did not sit. I took out my phone, pulled up the video, and placed it flat on the table, where all 3 board members could see the screen without moving. "East Corridor, 8:20 this evening." I pressed play. 47 seconds. The lighting had been low, but sufficient. The figures clear, the portfolio exchange unambiguous, the act of signing impossible to misread. No one spoke while it ran. When it ended, I set Diana's document beside the phone. "This is the originating authorization for the transaction in the video. The relevant detail is the second page, the counterparty signature line. It is unsigned. The transaction is not legally complete." Patricia turned to the second page. James examined the first without touching it. Marcus looked at neither. "This is fabricated," Marcus said. His voice held. "I gave him credit for that. The video has been manipulated. I don't know by whom, but what you just watched does not represent what happened in that corridor." He looked at Victor, not at me. "And I think it's worth asking why my cousin, who applied for a board seat 18 months ago and was turned down, is the one presenting it tonight." The detail was precise. It was also true. He had saved it and deployed it here in this room with the timing of someone who had rehearsed this contingency. The preparation behind it was more thorough than I had expected. "I'd like to make a call," I said. Victor nodded. Claire answered immediately. I put her on speaker. "The video has not been altered," she said without preamble. "Forensic examination confirms the metadata is intact, and the footage is consistent with unedited capture from the originating device. The document is consistent with materials I reviewed independently earlier this week through a separate channel." "Thank you," I said, and ended the call. Marcus was no longer looking at Victor. He was looking at the middle distance between his glass and the edge of the table, the particular unfocused gaze of someone whose internal calculations are moving faster than his composure can accommodate. "Marcus," Victor said. Just the name. No question attached. Spoken in the tone that invites response, without demanding one, which is somehow harder to sit across from than a direct accusation. Marcus said nothing. The silence that followed was not preparation. It was the absence of prepared material, and everyone in the room understood the difference. Patricia did not wait for it to resolve. She picked up her phone, found a number, and held it to her ear. "Robert," she said, when the line connected. "Third floor Magnolia Room. Now please." She set the phone face down on the table. "Corporate counsel," she said to no one in particular. "He's in the building." James had been reading the document since I placed it on the table. He read the first page with the sustained attention he brought to everything financial, the kind of reading that does not skim, that does not assume, that moves through each line. Because each line was written by someone with a purpose, and that purpose is worth understanding. He turned to the second page, read it, turned back to the first. Then he set the document flat on the table in front of him. He did not speak. He looked at Marcus with the expression of a man who has completed an assessment and is allowing its subject a moment to understand that the assessment has been made. Not anger, not satisfaction, something more durable than either the settled final quality of a conclusion. Then he looked at his watch. Robert Crane arrived 7 minutes after Patricia's call. He was a compact man in his early 50s, the kind of attorney who had spent so long inside corporate structures that he had taken on their qualities, precise and load-bearing, and not given to decoration. He came in without knocking, which told me he had been briefed in the corridor before entering, and he spent 4 minutes reviewing the materials on the table, in the particular way of someone confirming what he has already been told, rather than discovering it for the first time. When he finished, he leaned close to Victor and spoke quietly for less than a minute. Victor listened, nodded once, and then Robert Crane took a seat against the wall, not at the table, but behind it, the position of someone whose role in the room was to advise rather than to decide. And the room returned to its stillness. Victor reached beneath the table. He had brought a leather portfolio of his own, smaller than the one Raymond Cole had been carrying in the East Corridor, and considerably less dramatic in its presentation. He set it on the table, opened it, and removed a single sheet of paper. He placed it in the center of the table with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything, and for a moment he simply looked at it, as if confirming that the words on it were the ones he intended. Then he looked up. "Marcus," he said, "what I am about to read constitutes the board's formal finding under Section 14 of the Governance Protocol. You have the right to respond after I have finished. Corporate counsel is present. I would ask that everyone in this room allow me to complete the reading without interruption." Marcus said nothing. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, both of them palms down, fingers spread slightly. The posture of someone who has decided that stillness is the only remaining form of control available to him. Victor looked at the paper and began. The language was formal, in the way that consequential things tend to be formal. Not ornate, not designed to impress, but precise in the specific way of words that have been chosen, because they will be read again later by people who were not in this room. Victor read without inflection, which made it more difficult to hear, not less. The absence of editorial tone forced you to sit with the meaning of each phrase directly, without the buffer of someone else's interpretation. The finding cited 3 specific areas. The first was the unauthorized initiation of a transaction involving a controlling interest in Callaway Group without board notification or approval, in violation of the fiduciary obligations attendant to his position. The second was the engagement of legal counsel, with a documented history of professional misconduct to facilitate the transaction, representing a reckless disregard for the firm's legal and reputational interests. The third was the deliberate concealment of the transaction's existence from the board during a period in which the board had both the right and the responsibility to be informed. Victor finished reading, The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system running through the ceiling above us. Marcus exhaled a long, controlled breath that he released through his nose. The kind of breath that people take when they are trying to keep something contained that does not want to be contained. When he spoke, his voice was level, but the levelness had a different quality than it had carried earlier in the evening. Earlier, it had been confident. Now, it was effortful. "I want it on record," he said, "that the transaction was structured to benefit the firm. The terms were favorable. The counterparty was legitimate. I made a judgment call about timing and disclosure because I believed and still believe that premature notification would have compromised the negotiation." He paused. "I understand how it looks. I am asking the board to consider what it actually was." Victor gave him the courtesy of a moment's silence before responding. "The board has considered it," he said. "That consideration is reflected in the document I just read." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I could not name with precision. Not the cold preparation I had seen in the ballroom, not the effortful composure of the last several minutes, but something underneath both of those. Something that had less to do with the board and the document and the formal language of Section 14, and more to do with the specific fact of where he was and who was in the room with him. He did not look at me, but I felt the awareness of it. Patricia uncapped a pen and signed the document with the quick, certain motion of someone who had already made her decision long before the pen touched the paper. She passed it to James without comment. James read the signature line, just the line, not the document again, and signed beneath Patricia's name with the same absence of ceremony. He slid the document back to the center of the table. Victor picked it up, aligned it carefully, and turned it 180 degrees. He placed it in front of me. The signature line at the bottom of the page had 3 positions. Patricia's name was there. James's name was there. The third line was blank with my name printed beneath it in the small, neutral typeface of a document that had been prepared by someone who knew exactly who would be sitting at this table tonight. A pen appeared beside the paper Victor set down, without comment, available without pressure. I looked at the document, and without meaning to, without choosing to my mind, went back to a different table, in a different building, on a winter afternoon 3 years ago. A heavier pen, a different line, my name printed in the same neutral typeface beneath a signature line that had also been blank until I picked up what was offered and made it permanent. I had signed that document in 3 seconds. I had spent 3 years understanding what I had actually done. I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. I had made peace with this long before tonight. The sound a pen makes on heavy paper is different from the sound it makes on ordinary stock. It is a small distinction, the kind that most people never have occasion to notice. But in a room that has gone completely silent, no ventilation, hum, no distant music, no ambient noise of any kind, only 7 people, and the specific gravity of what is being decided, that small distinction becomes the only sound in the world. Deliberate, unhurried, final, in the way that very few sounds actually are. I signed my name. The pen moved across the line with the same steady pressure I brought to every document I had ever signed in a professional capacity. Not more, not less, nothing performative in the gesture, nothing that was for anyone else's benefit. When I reached the end of my signature, I lifted the pen and set it parallel to the edge of the paper, the way I always did, a habit so old I no longer noticed it. Then I sat very still for a moment. The room sat with me. Victor did not move to collect the document immediately. Patricia had her hands folded on the table in front of her, her attention resting somewhere in the middle distance, with the composed patience of someone who understands that certain moments require space to settle before anyone reaches for them. James had turned slightly in his chair, not toward the document, not toward me, but toward Marcus, with the peripheral assessing quality of attention he brought to anything he was not yet sure he fully understood. Robert Crane, against the wall, had stopped writing. Marcus was looking at the document, not at his glass, not at Victor, not at the wall across from him. at the document, and specifically at the place on it where my signature now sat beside the other 2-3 names in a row, occupying the line that had been printed for exactly this purpose, completing a formal record that would exist in the firm's files long after this evening had become a memory for everyone in the room. I watched him read my name. There is a specific quality to the moment when someone sees something they were not prepared to see. Not a surprise exactly, because surprises are quick. They move through a person and resolve into the next thing. But a slower reckoning, the kind that requires a person to stop and revise something they believed was settled. Marcus had spent the better part of his life understanding exactly who I was in relation to him. The categories had been established early and maintained consistently: younger, lesser, peripheral, present when useful, ignorable when not. The woman who had stood at the door of his party with a name tag on her lapel. The cousin who had been handed a printed card and pointed toward an entrance and had gone without argument, which confirmed everything he already assumed about where she stood. He had not revised any of that over the course of the evening. Not when I walked into the ballroom, not when Victor pulled the 5 of us into this room, not when I placed the phone on the table and pressed play. He had been so focused on the performance of his counter-narrative, the fabricated documentation, the detail about the board application, the careful modulation of his voice, that he had processed everything I presented as an obstacle to manage rather than a revelation to absorb. But the signature changed something. It was not the act of signing itself. It was what the signature represented: the specific authority required to place a name on that particular line of that particular document, the authority that did not belong to cousins or guests or women assigned to stand at doors. It belonged to board members. It belonged to people who had been in the room 3 years ago, when the position he currently held was created, who had cast the votes that made his title possible, who had the standing to unmake what they had made. I watched him understand it, not quickly, not in the sharp, immediate way of someone encountering a new piece of information. Slowly, the way understanding moves when it has to dismantle something before it can build anything in its place. I watched his gaze move from my name on the document to my face across the table, and I watched him make the connection between the two that he had failed to make at any point in the preceding 2.5 hours. The woman at the door, the name on the document, the same person. Victor reached forward and collected the paper with the quiet efficiency of someone concluding a procedural matter. He returned it to the leather portfolio, closed it, and set it beside him on the table. The meeting, in every practical sense, was over. Robert Crane uncapped his pen again and made a final notation on the pad he had been using throughout. Patricia straightened in her chair with the small releasing movement of someone whose work in a room is done. I pushed back from the table and stood. The chair made a soft sound against the carpet. I collected my phone from the table, where I had left it after Claire's call, checked that Diana's document was still in the interior pocket of my blazer, and turned toward the door. I did not say anything to Marcus. There was nothing left to say that the document had not already said more precisely and more permanently than I could have managed in words. I crossed the room. My hand reached the door handle, cool metal solid, the particular resistance of a well-made door before it yields. I pressed it down. Behind me, I heard Marcus say my name for the first time that night. Not Hostess, not Reagan, be a sweetheart, just Reagan. One word, too late. The hallway outside the Magnolia Room was the kind of quiet that only exists in places designed to absorb sound: thick carpet, climate-controlled air walls that held every conversation in and gave nothing back. I had taken maybe 4 steps when I heard my name. Reagan, Uncle Harold's voice. Not the version he used at family gatherings when everyone was performing affection for each other. The harder version. The one that came from 30 years of believing that age alone was a form of authority. He and Aunt Beverly were positioned near the corridor's midpoint, not passing through, not coincidentally nearby. They were standing the way people stand when they have been waiting, when they have spent the last several minutes rehearsing exactly what they planned to say, the moment a door opened. Aunt Beverly had her arms crossed. Uncle Harold had both hands in his jacket pockets, which was the closest he ever came to looking like he didn't know what to do with himself. I stopped. I didn't speak first. I had learned a long time ago that the person who fills a silence first is almost always the person who needs something from it. I didn't need anything from either of them tonight. Uncle Harold obliged. What did you do? He said it the way someone says something. They already believe they know the answer to not asking, confirming, setting up the anger they've already decided to feel. Marcus called Beverly from the hallway. He said you walked into that private meeting and presented some kind of... He called you from the meeting, I said. Uncle Harold paused. He stepped out briefly, Aunt Beverly said, filling the gap quickly, her voice carrying the specific tension of someone trying to hold a version of events together in real time. He told us you brought documents, that you made accusations in front of the board, that you tried to humiliate him in front of the people who... I didn't humiliate anyone, I said. I presented facts. There's a difference. The hallway absorbed that. Uncle Harold's expression moved through something. The initial certainty, cycling down into a gear I didn't see from him often. Something that wasn't quite doubt, but was standing close enough to it that I could see its outline. Reagan, his voice had shifted slower, now more careful. Whatever you think Marcus did, whatever you believe happened, that company, his position, his career, you don't understand what it took for him to build that. You don't understand what this family... I built it with him, I said. Aunt Beverly went still. I didn't raise my voice. There was no reason to. The carpet swallowed everything. The corridor offered nothing back, and the truth didn't require volume. 3 years ago, I said, Marcus's tenure as CEO was going to end before it began. There were 4 votes to remove him. I was the 5th. I was the vote that kept him in that chair. Uncle Harold opened his mouth. I continued, I am a board member of Callaway Group. I have been for 6 years. Not a consultant, not an advisor, a seated member with full voting rights and fiduciary authority. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. I know you didn't know that. Almost no one in this family did. That was by design mine. Aunt Beverly looked at Uncle Harold. Uncle Harold looked at me, the way a person looks when the room they thought they were standing in has quietly become a different room entirely. You're saying you're on the board, he said. The sentence came out flat, not quite a question, the phrasing of a man repeating something back to himself to hear whether it sounds real. I'm saying I have been on the board since before Marcus was appointed, I said. I'm saying that when the vote came, I chose him. I drafted the language of his appointment. I signed the document that put his name in that position. I did that because I believed in him, because he was family, because I thought the right opportunity in the right person's hands could become something worth building. The corridor was completely silent. And tonight, I said, I signed a different document, the one that ends his time in that role. Aunt Beverly's hand moved to her mouth. Uncle Harold didn't move. He was standing with the particular stillness of someone processing information that is restructuring something fundamental, not just a fact, but a framework. The story he had been telling himself about this family, about who mattered and who didn't, about who Reagan Foster actually was. The reason Marcus no longer holds that position, I said, is not because I wanted to hurt him. It's because he was using the company to fund a private arrangement that would have cost the firm everything. The board had evidence. I provided some of it. The rest was already there. I wasn't angry when I said it. I had been angry weeks ago, in my apartment reading those documents for the first time with Claire, on the phone, and my hands steadier than I expected them to be. But standing here now, in this carpeted corridor, with its sealed air, and its carefully held silence, I felt something different. Not satisfaction, not relief, something quieter than both. Uncle Harold exhaled slowly. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the version of itself that had greeted me in the corridor. What was left was smaller, more honest. Reagan, he said, we didn't know. I looked at him for a moment, at the man who had handed me a name tag with a smile that said, this is where you belong, and thought he was being kind. At the woman beside him who had never once asked what I actually did with my time, my work, my years. I know you didn't, I said. I held his gaze for one more second. That was always the problem. I turned and walked away. I didn't leave. Not yet. I stopped at the far end of the corridor, where the hallway opened into the wide, carpeted landing that overlooked the ballroom entrance, and I stood there. Not because I had anything left to do inside, not because I was waiting for anything. I stood there the way you sometimes stand at the edge of something that is already over, because some part of you understands that once you walk away, it becomes a memory, and memories have a way of softening the edges of things that deserve to stay sharp. So I stayed, and I watched. The St. Regis Ballroom at 10:05 p.m. looked from the outside almost exactly as it had at 7 o'clock. The chandeliers were still lit. The florals, white orchids, tall arrangements that had probably cost more per table than most people spend on a week of groceries were still standing. The gold balloon installations near the entrance still caught the light the way they had when the first guests arrived, when the evening was still a promise of something. But the room itself told a different story. It was the kind of deterioration that doesn't announce itself. No scene, no moment of visible collapse. Just the slow, quiet math of subtraction. A table with 4 chairs, suddenly occupied by 2, then 1, then none. Conversations that had been continuous becoming intermittent, then sparse, then absent. The specific sound a room makes when it is no longer holding together, not loud, not dramatic, just the low-frequency hum of something winding down before anyone has officially said so. I could see it from where I was standing. The guests who remained were clustered near the exits in the particular way that people cluster when they are trying to leave without appearing to be in a hurry. Small groups of 2 and 3 coats, already retrieved phones, already out the body language of people who had somewhere else to be and were recalculating the most graceful route to the door. A few were still seated at their tables, but even they had the stillness of people waiting for permission to go picking at the remains of a dessert course, turning a champagne flute slowly in their hands, looking anywhere but at the empty chair at the center of the room where a host was supposed to be standing. Marcus was not in this ballroom. That absence was its own kind of statement. There had been a moment earlier in the evening, around 8 o'clock, when the night was still running the way Marcus had designed it to run when he had moved through that room like a man who owned it. Not the building, the atmosphere, the attention, the particular gravitational pull of someone who believes completely and without question that they are exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they were born to do. I had watched it from the entrance. I had held the door for the guests who came to celebrate it. That version of the room was gone. What remained was the furniture, the flowers, the light, and the growing, wordless understanding among everyone still present that the reason they had all come here tonight had quietly ceased to exist. Near the back of the room, I could see the catering staff beginning the careful choreography of a wind-down that hadn't been scheduled for another 2 hours. Glasses being collected with an efficiency that was slightly too purposeful. A linen folded once, then set aside. The almost imperceptible shift in the room's staff, from serving an event to managing its conclusion. They had done this before. They knew what a room looked like when it was ending early. At the VIP table, the long rectangular one, near the stage, the one that had been set for 12, and had held at the height of the evening the firm's most consequential relationships, only one person was seated. Diana. She was sitting with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, the way a person sits when they are determined not to look like they are waiting. Her champagne glass was in front of her, still full from whenever it had last been poured. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the centerpiece, a tall arrangement of white orchids and trailing greenery that someone had spent real time constructing with the focused attention of a woman who had run out of things to do with her eyes and had decided that flowers were the safest place to leave them. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had been waiting ever since for the moment when the consequences of that decision finally arrived and she could stop anticipating them. I understood something about that feeling. The room continued its quiet math. Another couple stood, said brief goodbyes to the table beside them, and moved toward the exit. A man in a dark jacket spoke briefly into his phone, and then walked out without looking back. The orchestra, a 4-piece ensemble that had been playing through the dinner hour, had packed their instruments sometime in the last 20 minutes, their spot near the far wall, now marked only by the ghost of their music, stands still in position, the chairs pushed slightly back. $22,000. That had been the number. I had heard it referenced twice in the past week, once in passing, once in a context that made it clear it was meant to signal something about the scale of Marcus's success, the kind of man he had become, the distance he had traveled from the family's ordinary. From where I was standing, $22,000 looked like empty chairs and full champagne flutes and a woman sitting alone at a table set for 12. I looked at it for a long moment. The chandeliers did not care. The orchids didn't care. The light fell the same way it always had, even indifferent, illuminating everything with the same impartial brightness it would have offered a full room. I took one last look. I did not feel the triumph I thought I would. What I felt was something much quieter and much harder to name. The valet brought my car around at 10:17 p.m. I know the exact time because I looked at the dashboard clock the moment I pulled out of the St. Regis driveway. The way you sometimes note small, precise details when everything else about the evening has stopped feeling precise. The temperature outside was 61 degrees. The radio came on automatically, something low, instrumental, the kind of thing that plays in the background of moments you're not ready to examine yet, and I turned it off before the first measure finished. I wanted the quiet. Atlanta, at this hour, is not a silent city. It never fully is, but there is a version of it that exists only after 10 o'clock on a weeknight, a version where the streetlights hold the road in long amber intervals and the traffic thins to something almost manageable, and the city seems, for a little while, to be running on a slower frequency than it does during the hours when everyone is performing their lives for each other. I drove through it without thinking about where I was going. I knew the route home, the way you know things you've repeated so many times. They've stopped requiring attention. My hands were on the wheel. The lights moved past the window in the way that lights do when you're in motion, there and gone, each one lasting exactly as long as it takes to pass through it and no longer. The name tag was in my right hand. I hadn't realized I was still holding it until I stopped at a red light on Peachtree and felt the small, rectangular weight of it against my fingers. White. Laminated. The word Hostess printed in clean, sans serif type. The kind of font chosen specifically because it communicates nothing. It had been handed to me 5 hours ago by a woman who thought she was assigning me a role. It had been pinned to my jacket for approximately 40 minutes before I removed it and put it in my bag, somewhere between greeting the first guests and watching Victor Shaw read the word on it and say nothing. I had carried it all night. I looked at it in the red light's glow. It was just a piece of plastic, a small rectangle with a clip on the back and a word on the front that had been chosen for me by someone who had not spent a single moment wondering whether it fit. That was the thing about being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you. It doesn't happen in dramatic gestures most of the time. It happens in small ones, in the names people assign you without asking, in the roles they hand you without hesitation, because it has never occurred to them that you might occupy a different one. The light changed. I drove. I thought about the vote I had cast 3 years ago in a boardroom in this same city. The way I had said Marcus's name with something close to conviction, not because the decision was easy, but because I had believed in the logic of it. He had the energy. He had the relationships. He had the particular hunger of someone who understood that opportunity has a shelf life and was not willing to let it expire. I had looked at all of that, and I had signed my name to it, and I had believed, sitting in that chair, at that table, that I was doing something that mattered. I had been right. I had also been wrong. Both things were true. I was still working out what to do with that. There is a kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name, the kind that comes not from losing something, but from choosing to end something you once chose to build. It's quieter than the grief that arrives without warning. It sits differently in the chest. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in the way that weight settles gradually. And then all at once, and then in a way that feels like it has always been there. I had known, walking into the St. Regis tonight, that I was going to leave with this feeling. I had made peace with that in my apartment the night before, in the hours between midnight and the particular stillness that comes just before 4 in the morning, when the city outside is as quiet as it gets, and there is nothing left to do but sit with what you've decided. I had thought I was prepared. I was not entirely prepared. The streets of Atlanta moved past me. A gas station, a pharmacy, still lit but empty. A row of apartments with one window on the 3rd floor, still showing light. Somewhere in this city, Marcus was dealing with the beginning of what came next. Somewhere Diana was probably in a car, not entirely, unlike this one, carrying her own version of the evening, her own particular weight. Somewhere Uncle Harold and Aunt Beverly were having a conversation that I would not be part of and could not control and did not need to think about tonight. I had done what I came to do. That was supposed to feel like something. I turned onto my street. The familiar sequence of it, the slight curve, the row of trees whose roots had started lifting the sidewalk in 2 places. The neighbor's porch light that was always on moved past the windows the way it always did. And for a moment, I felt the dissonance of returning to something ordinary after an evening that had been anything but. I pulled into the driveway. I put the car in park, and I sat there in the dark with the engine still running and the name tag still in my hand, and I set it on the passenger seat the way you set something down when you are finally ready to stop carrying it. I let my hands fall into my lap, and then quietly, in the way that things happen, when there is no one watching and no version of yourself you have to perform for, I cried. Not because I had lost, but because winning felt exactly like losing, just with better lighting. 3 weeks later, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, reading a headline I had been expecting for a while. Not with satisfaction, not with the particular relief of someone waiting for a thing to happen and finally watching it arrive. Just reading it, the way you read news about something you were part of when you are far enough away from it that it no longer feels like yours. The investigation into Callaway Group's attempted offshore transaction had been opened formally by the state attorney's office 11 days after the St. Regis. Claire had told me it was coming. She had seen the paperwork moving through the right channels, had watched the preliminary inquiries turn into something with more institutional weight behind them. It wasn't a surprise. What surprised me mildly was how quickly it had moved. These things usually take longer. Usually there are delays, procedural pauses, the slow, bureaucratic metabolism of due process finding its rhythm. This one had not waited. Marcus had retained an attorney, not Raymond Cole, who had his own professional situation to manage now, but someone from a firm I recognized, the kind of firm that charges by the quarter hour and operates out of an office building where the lobby alone costs more per square foot than most people's apartments. It was a sensible choice under the circumstances. I didn't follow the details closely after that. I had given the board what they needed, Claire had filed the appropriate disclosures, and what happened next was no longer my responsibility to carry. I let it go. The same way you let go of something you've been holding for a long time. Not all at once, not dramatically, just finger by finger, until your hand is empty and you realize the weight is gone. Diana filed for legal separation 22 days after the party. I heard about it from Jordan, who had heard about it through a mutual connection in the firm's administrative circle. I didn't ask for details. I wasn't sure I was entitled to them. Diana had made her choice the night she walked into that restroom and handed me a single page of paper with a blank signature line. She had made it long before that, probably, in the way that people make the decisions that matter most of all. Quietly, and without announcement, in the private hours, when no one is watching. She didn't owe me an explanation. I didn't need one. I hoped she was somewhere that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The board convened 3 weeks after the St. Regis to confirm an interim appointment. The name that came out of that meeting was someone I had voted for, though not someone I had championed, a steady, careful executive who had been with the firm for 11 years and understood its architecture in the way that only people who have lived inside a thing long enough can understand it. Not a visionary, not a disruptor. Someone who would rebuild trust the way houses are rebuilt after a storm, systematically, material by material, without drawing attention to the process. It was the right call. I signed that document too. It felt different than the last one. Uncle Harold called on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a meeting, not the kind that can be interrupted, and not the kind where you look at your phone and see a name you recognize and decide the name can wait. I let it go to voicemail. When the meeting ended, I sat in the conference room for a moment after everyone else had filed out, looking at the notification on my screen, and I thought about what I knew that voicemail contained. An apology. Some version of one, at least. The particular formulation of "we didn't know" that people reach for when they are trying to acknowledge something, without fully accounting for the years that made it possible. I had heard that kind of apology before, not from Uncle Harold specifically, but from people who occupy the same position in a story, who arrive at understanding only once the cost of misunderstanding has become impossible to ignore. I didn't delete the voicemail. I also didn't listen to it. I left it sitting there, in the way you leave certain things, not because you intend to return to them, but because deleting them feels like a declaration you're not ready to make, and leaving them feels like keeping a door open that you're not sure you want to close. Maybe I'd listen to it eventually. Maybe I wouldn't. There was no urgency either way. The urgency had been on a different night, in a different room, and it had already passed. Aunt Beverly sent a card, handwritten on cream-colored stationery, the kind of card that requires a person to sit down and think about what they want to say before they begin. I read it once and put it on my desk under a coffee mug, and it was still there 3 days later, which meant I hadn't decided what to do with it either. That felt honest. I had always preferred honesty to resolution, even when resolution was simpler. What I know now, standing on the other side of that night, is this. I spent 6 years being invisible to the people who thought they knew me. Not because I was hiding, I was never hiding, but because they had decided early, and without much deliberation, what kind of person I was. And once a person has been categorized, it takes a great deal of evidence to undo it. Sometimes it takes $22,000 worth of a party falling apart in real time. Sometimes even that isn't enough. But something shifted. In the weeks after the St. Regis, I felt it in small ways. A different quality of attention in certain conversations. A particular pause before assumptions were made. The subtle recalibration that happens in people who are processing the fact that they were wrong about something they were certain of. They finally saw me, but by then, I had already stopped needing them to. I want to step outside of the story for a moment, not because the story is over. In real life, stories like this one don't end cleanly. There is no final scene, no moment where the music swells and everything resolves into something you can frame and hang on a wall. What there is instead is a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later, where you're sitting with cold coffee and a newspaper, and the strange, quiet realization that you made it to the other side of something that once felt impossible to survive. That feeling, the one I couldn't name in the parking lot of the St. Regis, the one I described as quieter than triumph and harder to explain than grief. I've had some time to sit with it now, and I think I finally know what it was. It was the specific weight of having done the right thing when the right thing cost you something real. Not money, not status. Something harder to replace the version of yourself that still believed the people who were supposed to know you actually did. That version doesn't come back exactly. You don't mourn it forever either. But there is a moment somewhere between the decision and the aftermath where you feel its absence clearly, where you understand that clarity and loss are not opposites, that you can know completely and without question that you made the right call, and still feel the weight of what that call required you to give up. That's what I felt sitting in my car at the end of that night. I want to talk to you about 3 things, not as lessons exactly. I've never been comfortable with the idea that one person's experience translates cleanly into instructions for another person's life, but as things I know now that I didn't fully understand before. The first is this: kindness without boundaries is not kindness. It's a loan you've forgotten to document. When I voted for Marcus 3 years ago, I told myself it was belief. And it was partly. But it was also the particular generosity of someone who has never been asked to account for the cost of her own generosity. I gave him a future without asking what he intended to build with it. I signed my name to his career without conditions, without conversation, without the basic acknowledgement between two people that what is being exchanged has value and therefore requires care. I thought love the family kind, the kind that comes with shared last names and holiday tables and decades of accumulated history, was enough to make the terms clear. It wasn't. If you are someone who gives freely, who shows up when asked, who extends trust because it feels right and generous, and like the kind of person you want to be, please hear this. None of that is wrong. All of that is worth keeping. But generosity without the ability to say, this is what I need in return, and this is what I will not accept, is not a virtue. It is an open door with no lock. And there are people in this world, sometimes the people closest to you, who will walk through it without ever asking whether you intended to leave it open. You are allowed to close it. You are allowed to have done something generous and true and real, and still decide that you will not do it again without better terms. The second thing is this: silence is not the same as absence. I spent 6 years on a board that shaped the direction of a company, made decisions that affected hundreds of people, and signed my name to documents that carried real institutional weight, and almost no one in my personal life knew. Not because I was ashamed of it, because I had learned early and from experience that the people who announce themselves the loudest are not always the ones doing the most, and because I had come to understand that there is a particular kind of power that only works when it is not performing itself for an audience. If you are someone who works quietly, who builds without broadcasting, who contributes without making sure everyone in the room knows the contribution is yours, I want you to know something. The work is real. The work counts. The fact that certain people couldn't see it was never a reflection of its value. It was a reflection of their attention. You do not need to be loud to be significant. You do not need to be recognized by everyone to matter. The people who needed to know knew. The third thing is the hardest one to say because it requires admitting something that doesn't resolve into comfort. Sometimes you will trust the wrong person. You will do it with your whole heart, with genuine intention, with every reason to believe you are making a sound decision, and you will still be wrong. And when that happens, the question is not how you failed to see it coming. The question is what you do with what you know once you can no longer pretend otherwise. You don't have to answer that question the night it becomes clear to you. I didn't. I drove home. I sat in my driveway. I let myself feel it without trying to name it or fix it or perform some version of moving on that I wasn't ready for yet. And then eventually, not all at once, but gradually, the way things actually heal, rather than the way we wish they would, I figured out how to carry it without letting it change who I was. That is the whole lesson, I think. Not the name tag, not the party, not the board resolution, or the investigation, or the empty chairs at a $22,000 table. The lesson is that you can go through something that was genuinely hard, something that asked more of you than you expected to give, and come out the other side still knowing who you are. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been the person standing at the door, I see you, drop a comment below and tell me your story.